Well, Behnam Taleblu is a senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies, and he joins us now. Good evening to you. So in demanding a legally binding treaty, isn't Iran just asking the impossible of the US?
Well, it's a pleasure to be back with you again. I think Iran is indeed asking the impossible, but what Iran is also looking for beyond this impossible, I would say, and that puts us in a very interesting position, is to tie the U.S. up politically, legally, economically, and strategically into several knots. Do not forget, the Islamic Republic considers the United States of America enemy number one. The Islamic Republic does not all of a sudden, and will not all of a sudden, look with great light and interest on the American legal system or the American judiciary or the concept of checks and balances between the Congress and the executive, the treaty-making power versus simply an executive agreement. The Islamic Republic is simply looking to use these domestic vectors to try to actually hamper the existing sanctions strategy and to prevent further sanctions, again, sanctions which are based on a broad spectrum of Iranian bad behavior, be it in the nuclear domain, at-home human rights repression, cyber activities, escalation and abroad, the maritime domain, the missile and military, arms production, procurement and proliferation, as well as its illicit nuclear activities. So consider this really Iran trying to impede the diplomatic process and prevent enforcement of current sanctions, as well as actually prevent enforcement and addition of future sanctions.
And isn't the US increasingly playing the weaker hand in these negotiations, not least because China has weakened the effect of those sanctions by doing business and trading with Iran, aside from the fact that the Iranians will not even sit in the same room as the Americans in Vienna?
Well, even before we get to the question of China, because the Chinese in late 2021, for instance, have critiqued some of Iran's nuclear advances, and many thought that would be a potential vector for a rift between the PRC and the IRI. I certainly don't think so, because even before and after the Obama-era sanctions and before and after the Trump-era sanctions, China remained, was, is, and shall be the largest licit and the largest illicit importer of Iranian oil and petroleum products. Therefore, the Chinese really continue to underwrite Iran's intransigence in Vienna, as well as continue to fund indirectly through continued oil sales, exports, storage even, the kind of activities that the Islamic Republic engages in the region. But to pivot to the U.S. here, I think the U.S. had a great hand and played it poorly, whereas the Iranians had a pretty weak hand and have been playing it quite well. And this is not abnormal. This has happened in multiple rounds of negotiations that led to the JCPOA. The U.S. had economic leverage and couldn't quite capitalize on it politically. And I think in many ways there's something of a deja vu going on.
What about verification? That seems to be a big hold-up at the talks right now, because there's no way to make sure that the international community will be able to ensure that Iran is complying with any future deal.
That's right. As Iran's nuclear advances have increased, particularly in November 2020 to present, where some of these have been called by experts irreversible, providing the regime with knowledge that puts it much, much closer to potential weapons-grade uranium production, taking advantage of the fact that the Biden administration wants to pivot away from the coercive and economic pressure strategy of the Trump administration and again try its hand at engagement. Ultimately, I think that the U.S. is in the right city, but focusing on the wrong track. It's in Vienna, in Austria, trying to resurrect the JCPOA through the P5+1. As you mentioned, being forced to sit at the children's table, being forced to sit away from the Iranians in these talks. That is the wrong track. The right track is to focus on supporting the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, which is in Vienna, which multiple times in 2021 was alone, had to go strike a bunch of side deals just to get a little bit more access to monitoring, just to get a little bit more access to its own surveillance equipment. I think the minimum that Washington should be doing in 2022 is to have the IAEA's back and call for a special session of the Board of Governors to censure the Islamic Republic for failing to actually provide access to some sites, facilities, and more importantly, to questions about undeclared traces of man-made uranium.
Behnam Taleblu at the FDD, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much.